The mule's breath steamed in the frigid dusk as I reined him toward Red Bluff Crossing, the wagon wheels groaning over rutted ground where pockets of snow still clung in the hollows. I meant to be in and out before nightfall, just a sack of grain for the stock and a salt block for the trough. The wind was sharp enough to find the seams in my coat, the kind of cold that stripped a man's thoughts down to simple needs. But as I passed the sagging shape of the old train platform, my hands tightened on the reins. There under the warped awning, a figure lay curled on the boards, still as a dropped shawl, bare feet against the frost-dark wood. For a moment I thought she might be gone already, until I saw her breath cloud faintly in the air. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever stood at a crossroads where one choice could change everything. I was born in the high flats west of the Pine Valley Range, the youngest of 3 boys. My folks ran cattle, worked their hands to the bone to keep us fed and clothed, and kept Sunday mornings for the Lord no matter what the weather threatened. My mother believed in lending a hand when a neighbor was down, and in keeping your word even when it cost you. My father taught me that a good fence and a straight gaze did more to keep peace than any number of guns. We lived lean flour and beans through the winter meat, when the hunt was good coin only when the herd was driven to market. It was a hard life, but it was ours, and the land gave back what you put into it. Things changed when the railroad surveyors came measuring and marking as if they'd been invited. With them came the speculators' men with store-bought boots and polished words, more interested in deeds than in the people working the ground. They offered my father a price for our spread that might have dazzled another man, but he said no without a second thought. That refusal brought trouble quick. A neighbor we'd known since I was a boy struck a bargain with a mining outfit and turned his back when they came for us. Hired hands torched our barn one night, poisoned the well the next. I rode in from the north pasture to find smoke settling over blackened timbers and the corral gate swinging open into emptiness. My father and brothers were gone, taken in the fight that followed. The county sheriff came late, took statements without looking me in the eye, and left me with nothing but scorched earth and a name that no longer held sway. I put what I could salvage on a wagon and headed west until the hills swallowed me. Built a cabin where the ridge breaks to the south and learned to live without voices in the room. The seasons turned without asking my leave, and I let them. I went to town only when I had to, speaking little, keeping my eyes down, trading hides or stock for what I couldn't make myself. That evening was meant to be no different, get the mule grain turned back before dark settled in. But now the sky was closing, the clouds heavy with snow, and there was someone lying under that awning, her dress in rags, and her face half hidden by a tangle of hair. I set the brake on the wagon, the boards creaking under my boots as I stepped down. The wind lifted the edge of her skirt, showing skin marked by cold and bruises. She didn't stir when I stopped beside her. The station door stayed shut, no sign of anyone else watching. I told myself to keep walking, to leave her to whatever had put her there. My hand hovered over the edge of my coat, then closed around the buttons. I stepped closer, the wind pushing cold under my collar as I crouched beside her. Her knees were drawn tight to her chest and tucked between them, her face half hidden beneath tangled strands of dark hair. When her eyes opened, just a sliver, they caught the fading light, green sharp under the dirt and weariness. She didn't speak. I shrugged out of my coat, easing it around her shoulders, careful not to startle her. The fabric swallowed her frame, but she pulled it close as if she meant to keep it. "I've got a place," I said, voice low, so it wouldn't carry in the empty street. "Fire, food, nobody else." She didn't answer, but when I slid an arm behind her back and another under her knees, she didn't resist. Lifting her, I could feel how much weight she'd lost. The heaviness, not from size, but from the way her body gave all at once. I carried her to the wagon, set her gently in the bed, and pulled a wool blanket over her. She curled inward, silent. The mule's ears flicked when I took the reins again. The station windows showed a single figure watching the clerk leaning in the frame, but making no move to open the door. We left the town behind the sound of the wagon wheels groaning against frozen ruts, the only measure of time. I glanced back now and then. She hadn't shifted much, but I could hear the faint pull of her breath under the blanket. By the time we reached the cabin, the sky was nearly black clouds, hanging low with the promise of more snow. I carried her inside the door's hinges, creaking as I kicked it shut. The fire was low, but the warmth was enough to bring color to her cheeks. I laid her on the cot along the far wall, covered her with another blanket, and set water to heat on the stove. She watched me, eyes following each movement, though she didn't speak until I handed her a tin cup. "This your place?" she asked, her voice thin. I nodded. "Yes." Her gaze drifted to the walls, the shelves lined with jars, the rough-hewn table and chairs. "You live alone?" Most of the time, I said, setting a folded undershirt and a pair of wool socks on the cot. "That dress won't last another day." She didn't reach for the clothes, only stared at the steaming cup in her hands. "Aren't you going to ask what happened to me?" "No," I said, sitting back in the chair near the door. She studied me for a long moment. "Why not? If you wanted to tell it, you would." That seemed to settle something in her. She ate slowly, her hands trembling less as the warmth worked through her. Before turning in, I gave her a second blanket and told her she could have the bed. I'd take the chair. She looked almost puzzled, then nodded, pulling the covers higher. "You don't know me," she said quietly. "Don't need to," I answered. The fire had burned low when her breathing settled into an even rhythm. I pulled my coat from the peg and laid it over her where the blanket had slipped, then sat down again. The wind whispered around the eaves, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't mind the sound of another person in the room. Morning brought a gray light through the shutters, heavy with the promise of more snow. I eased from the chair, added wood to the fire, and stepped outside to break the ice on the water trough. The cold bit into my fingers, but the work was quick feed for the stock check, the lean-to roof. When I came back in, she was sitting up, the coat still around her hair, pushed back from her face. "You stayed," she said, as if surprised. "I live here," I replied, setting down the bucket. She glanced toward the door, then back at me. "I figured you'd be gone at first light." Her hands fidgeted with the torn seam at her collar before pulling the coat tighter. I poured coffee into 2 tin mugs, handed one to her. She cupped it in both hands, eyes fixed on the steam. "Calla," she said finally. "That's my name." "Ewan Creed," I answered. She nodded, her gaze still lowered. "I was staying with my uncle, Reverend Morgan. He owed money. Figured he could pay part of it with me, same as a head of cattle." Her jaw tightened. "I left before he could." I didn't speak, just kept my eyes on hers until she glanced away. "He told folks I wasn't even worth $5. She said the words sharper than before. "They believed him." "You believe him?" I asked. Her brow furrowed, but after a moment she shook her head. "Not anymore." She noticed the stack of shirts in the crate near the wall. "That one's coming apart," she said. "I'll sew it for you." "You don't need to," I told her. "I want to," she replied with a steadiness that told me the offer mattered. The day passed without much talk. She bathed behind a blanket hung near the stove, wearing the undershirt and socks, afterward cinched at the waist with a bit of cord. By evening, she was standing at the table, helping chop vegetables for stew. Her hands moving slow, but sure. "You don't talk much," she said, glancing up from the cutting board. "I say what needs saying," I answered. A hint of a smile touched her lips. "I like that." We ate by the fire, the cabin quiet except for the pop of the wood. When the bowls were empty, she gathered them up without being asked, set them by the wash basin, and paused near the cot. "You never asked what they did to me," she said. "I don't need to know unless you want to tell it." Her face tightened, then eased. Not tonight. All right. She settled under the blankets, turning toward the wall. I sat back in the chair, boots crossed, listening to the wind slide along the cabin roof. The coals glowed red in the hearth. She was here, and for now that was enough. Outside, the snow was falling thicker, drifting against the porch rails. The trail to town would be gone by morning. I glanced once more toward the cot, before leaning back, the fire's light warming my face. Somewhere in that quiet, I heard the faint crunch of hooves in the distance, carrying in over the wind, and knew someone was riding in. The sound of hooves grew clearer, breaking the muffled hush of the snowfall. I set my cup on the table, crossed to the door, and pulled it open just enough to see out. A lone rider was coming along the trail from the east, his horse moving slow through the drifts. I recognized the coat before I could see his face, Sam Willett, a trapper who ranged the backside of the ridge this time of year. We traded from time to time when our paths crossed, and he'd never made the ride here without reason. By the time I stepped outside, Sam had drawn up near the porch, snow thick on his hat brim. "Cold morning," he said, swinging down stiffly. "Figured I'd check in. Saw your wagon tracks head out yesterday." His eyes shifted toward the cabin. "You've got company." "She's resting," I said, not offering more. Sam nodded once, as if that was enough. He reached into his coat, pulled out a folded scrap of paper. "Brought you this from town. Clerk said a freight order came in you didn't collect. Thought you might want to know." I took the paper, scanning the few lines. It could wait. "You eaten?" I asked. "Not since dawn." I pushed the door open for him, the heat from the fire rolling out. Calla was sitting at the table, the coat pulled snug around her. She looked up when we stepped in. Sam tipped his hat in greeting, but didn't linger on her. Over coffee, we spoke little, just the way men do when there's no rush. Sam mentioned sign of cougar up near the North Gulch, warned me to keep the stock close. When he left, the snow had let up, the light sharpening against the hills. I watched him ride out until he disappeared behind the ridge, then turned back inside. The days that followed settled into a kind of rhythm. Calla moved slower than she liked, but each morning she was on her feet before the sun cleared the ridge. She folded the blanket, swept the floor with the broom I kept by the door, and set water to heat without being asked. The bruises along her jaw and arms faded, leaving only pale traces. Her hands steadied when she worked the needle, mending seams in shirts that had gone thin at the elbows. One afternoon, while I was splitting kindling by the lean-to, she came to the doorway and leaned on the jamb. "You always live this far from town?" she asked. "Since I built this place," I said, setting another piece on the block. She watched a moment, the wind stirring the loose strands of her hair. "Seems quiet here?" "It is." She didn't say more, just stepped back inside. Later, while she chopped vegetables for the stew, she said, "I can work a garden come spring. Grew up planting rows before I could reach the top rail." I nodded. So did I. That evening, the wind rose hard, rattling the shutters. I checked the latches on the doors and brought in more wood. Calla was by the fire, mending a tear in her undershirt. The lamplight caught her hair where it fell over her shoulder. She glanced up. "Where will you keep the hens when it gets worse?" "In here if I have to," I said. "Done it before." The storm hit after dark, a steady roar across the roof. I carried the hens in two at a time, settling them in a crate near the hearth. Calla held the lid while I moved them, laughing once when one pecked at her sleeve. It was the first real sound of lightness I'd heard from her. When the work was done, we sat near the fire, steam rising from our coats. She rubbed her arms, the undershirt clinging to her shoulders where the fabric had dampened. "You don't have to pretend not to look," she said quietly. "I look because I'm a man," I said, "not because I expect anything." Her eyes met mine. "That's why I'm still here." The storm kept us inside most of the next day. We took turns tending the fire and keeping the hens settled. She washed our dishes at the basin while I repaired a loose handle on the shovel. Now and then, her eyes followed what I was doing, as if she were learning the steps in case she had to do them herself. That evening, as the wind eased, she spoke again. "When you found me, I kept wondering when it would turn, when you'd want the same as everyone else did." I didn't answer right away. The fire cracked in the hearth, the smell of pine smoke curling through the room. "You think that's what this is?" I asked finally. She shook her head. "No. That's why it's harder." I set the mended shovel aside, walked to the basin, and poured warm water into a tin. "Your hands are still raw from the cold," I said. "Let me help." She hesitated, then came to the table, resting her palms upward. I worked the cloth gently over her skin, slow strokes to bring back the warmth. She watched my face without speaking. No one's ever done that without wanting something after she said softly. I dried her hands and stepped back. "I don't take what isn't offered." Her gaze held steady. "What if it is?" I could feel the weight of the question, but I kept my voice even. "Then I want to be sure it's not something you feel you have to give." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm offering it." I nodded once the space between us closing without hurry. She moved toward the cot, turned back to look at me, and I followed. The night passed slow, the fire's glow casting long shadows along the walls. Outside, the snow fell again, quiet and steady. By morning, the trail was buried, and the air held the stillness that comes before another change. The snow had softened the edges of the world, blanketing the hills and folding the rough land into quiet shapes. The fire crackled low in the hearth as I stirred the pot of stew, its savory scent filling the small cabin. Calla sat near the window, sunlight catching the strands of her hair now brushed clean and falling loose across her shoulders. She moved with a careful steadiness, every motion measured, but less guarded than before. The bruises that had once marked her skin faded to pale memories, and the faint color returning to her cheeks was the kind that grew from something stronger than warmth. That morning, I'd finished feeding the horses and was stacking kindling when she appeared on the porch, wrapped in my old coat and boots, twice too large, tied tight with twine around her ankles to keep them from slipping. She stepped slow and cautious, testing the feel of solid ground beneath her feet again. I watched through the frost-lined window as she made a tight circle around the yard, her breath puffing out in short clouds against the cold air. When she came back inside, cheeks flushed from the wind, she smiled faintly, her first real smile since I'd found her beneath the station awning. We settled into a rhythm born of the land itself. Each morning, she swept the floor unasked, folded the blankets with care, and prepared the cabin without fuss. I kept my eyes on the fence line or the weather, letting the silence between us stretch without pressing for words. When she helped with chores, it was with a quiet determination that spoke of survival, not obligation. Her hands, once shaky, now moved with steady purpose. At night, we sat near the fire, letting its warmth wrap around us as the wind moaned outside, scraping against the shutters and rattling the loose boards. One evening, while she was chopping vegetables for the stew, she broke the quiet. "You ever wish you'd stayed in town, started over?" she asked without looking up. Her voice held no accusation, just a simple question. I leaned against the doorframe, watching the firelight flicker across the floor. "I don't know," I said slowly. "Never thought it'd matter." She glanced at me, then eyes soft but steady. "Maybe it still does." She didn't press me further, but that night as I watched the fire's glow, I could feel a shift in the room. Something unspoken but clear. The way her coat slipped from one shoulder, revealing pale skin against the lamplight, told me we were no longer just two strangers sharing a roof. Something was growing in the space between us. Days folded into one another, slow and measured, as the snow deepened beyond the cabin walls. We brought the hens inside to keep them from the worst of the storm. A chicken pecked at her boot, and she laughed, a soft, genuine sound that filled the room and caught me off guard. For the first time since that frozen evening, the cabin felt less empty. One night, as the wind held along the corners of the roof and the firelight danced in our eyes, she reached for my hand across the table. Her voice was low, steady. "You don't look at me like the others did. Not like I'm broken." The way she said it, there was no bitterness, only a quiet hope. I moved to sit beside her, the warmth of the fire mingling with the slow thaw of something more between us. Our first kiss was soft and careful, a question asked in silence. She didn't pull away. When we lay down, the steady unfolding of long-denied tenderness settled between us. No rush, no fear, just two bodies finding space to heal. The next morning, light spilled through the window, catching the faint smile on her lips as she stirred beside me. The snow outside softened to a pale glaze, and for the first time, the long road back to town didn't feel so far. But with the thaw came the first hint of change, an unexpected knock at the door, steady and deliberate, promising that the past wasn't done with us yet. The knock came again, firm, but without hurry. I crossed the room, the floorboards giving under my boots, and opened the door to find Sheriff Tom Keating standing on the porch. He was a broad man, shoulders filling his coat, the brim of his hat dusted with snow. We'd known each other for years, though we only spoke when duty or necessity called for it. "Morning, Ewan," he said, his breath fogging in the air. "Mind if I step in?" I moved aside, and he stamped the snow from his boots before crossing the threshold. Calla had risen from her seat near the hearth, the coat wrapped close, her eyes watchful. Keating's gaze flicked toward her, but held no surprise. He removed his hat and warmed his hands over the fire. "Got word from town," he said, glancing between us. "A Reverend Morgan's been asking after a young woman. Matches your company's description." He didn't press the matter, just let the words settle. Calla's chin lifted slightly, her fingers tightening on the edge of the blanket. What else did he say? That she left without his blessing. Claims she owes him for his trouble. Keating's tone carried no judgment, but I could tell he didn't put much weight in the Reverend's words. "She doesn't owe him anything," I said. The sheriff studied us a moment longer before nodding. "Figured as much. I'll tell him I didn't see her." He replaced his hat, gave a short nod to Calla, and let himself out, leaving the door to close against the cold. The wind had picked up again by afternoon, snow sweeping across the yard in thin sheets. We brought the stock in closer, fed the hens, and checked the lean-to for loose boards. Calla worked beside me without complaint, her breath coming in white clouds. That night the fire burned high, the room filled with the scent of pine. She was seated at the table, sewing a patch onto one of my shirts. "He'll come looking," she said quietly. Maybe I answered, setting another log on the fire. Her eyes lifted to mine. "I'm not going back. I didn't figure you would." The days that followed passed with a steady calm, but something in her movements had changed. She walked with more purpose, her gaze meeting mine without the flicker of retreat I'd seen before. She began tending to small tasks on her own, splitting kindling, setting bread to rise, checking the henhouse for eggs before I stepped outside. One morning, after clearing the yard of snowdrifts, I found her standing by the window, watching the ridge. The light caught her face in a way that softened its sharper lines. "You've been thinking," I said. "I don't want to live like I'm waiting for someone to come take me away," she replied. "I want to make this mine, too." "You already have," I told her, but she only gave a faint smile and turned back to the window. Late that week, the snow eased and the air carried the first hint of thaw. I hitched the wagon to check the fence line, and Calla asked to ride along. She sat beside me, her coat pulled tight, the cold biting at our cheeks as the wheels cut through the softened ruts. We didn't speak much, but her presence was steady, a weight beside me that felt right. When we returned, she stepped down before I could offer a hand, landing light in the slush. She carried in the feed without being asked, her boots leaving wet marks across the floor. By the time I came inside, she was setting coffee on the table. That evening, as the light faded, she set her sewing aside and looked at me across the fire's glow. "You took me in when you didn't have to," she said. "You've given me more than I've had in a long time. I want to give something back." "You have," I replied, but she shook her head. "I want to stand beside you, not just be under your roof." The fire popped, and for a long moment neither of us moved. I could see the resolve in her eyes, the same determination I'd seen when she first wrapped my coat tighter around herself on that station porch. "We'll make it so," I said at last. Her shoulders eased, and she nodded once, her gaze holding mine. The rest of the night passed in quiet, the wind dropping to a low murmur outside. But as I banked the fire before bed, a thought stayed with me that what had begun as shelter was becoming something neither of us had expected, and it would soon be tested. The thaw came slow that year, the snow shrinking back to patches of crust along the north fence and the air losing its bite by degrees. The trail to town cleared just enough for wagon wheels, though the ruts were soft and deep. Calla stood at the porch rail one morning watching me hitch the team. "I'd like to ride in," she said. Her voice was calm, but I knew it meant more than a trip for supplies. We sat side by side on the bench, the wagon creaking as it rolled over the half-frozen road. The hills still carried their winter colors, muted browns and grays. But the creek ice had broken, running high with meltwater. We spoke little each turn of the wheel, bringing us closer to Red Bluff Crossing. She kept her eyes forward, one hand resting lightly on the folded blanket in her lap. The town looked no different, weathered fronts leaning into the wind, the same narrow boardwalks, the same faces watching from doorways. We stopped in front of the general store. The sound of our boots on the plank walk drew a few glances, and one man near the feed barrels leaned to say something under his breath. I caught the shape of the words and felt my jaw tighten, but Calla stepped past without slowing. Inside, the air smelled of lamp oil and burlap. Grover, the clerk, glanced up from the counter, his eyes settling on Calla for a moment before he reached for the scale. We picked out coffee, salt, a sack of flour. Calla carried the list, handing each item to Grover without looking away. He wrapped the goods in brown paper, said the total, and slid the bundle across the counter. On the way out, she paused at the top of the steps, looking down the length of the street. "That used to ruin me," she said quietly. "Being looked at like that." I adjusted the load in my arms. "You don't have to go in again if you don't want to." She shook her head. "I will. Until I stop caring." The ride back was slower, the road soft under the wheels. Near home, we stopped where the fence curved around a patch of open ground. I told her it had once been my mother's garden beans, tomatoes, herbs strung to dry above the stove. She studied the space for a moment, the early sun catching her profile. "We could plant again," she said. "We could," I answered. Over the next weeks, the days stretched longer. The hens began laying more, and the ground softened enough to turn. Calla took to the work as if she'd been waiting for it. Boots caked in mud, sleeves rolled, hair tied back with a strip of linen. She dug straight rows, the air carrying the scent of damp earth. I worked the fence while she planted, both of us moving to a quiet rhythm shaped by the land. One evening, she stood in the doorway barefoot, the last light behind her, holding a cup of coffee. "Do you think they'll stop talking?" she asked. "No," I said. She smiled faintly. "It doesn't matter." That night we sat on the porch, with the cool air settling over the hills, the sound of frogs rising from the creek bottom. The garden rose began to sprout tender green, pushing through the soil. Calla tended them each morning before the heat, Rose brushing the dirt from her hands as she came back inside. There was a steadiness to her now, a weight in the way she carried herself. She wasn't waiting for the next turn of trouble, she was making something to stand on. It was late in the afternoon when I saw dust on the road beyond the ridge, a single rider moving at a measured pace. The sun was low enough to throw his shadow long across the trail. Calla stepped to the porch rail beside me, her hand resting against the wood. Neither of us spoke as the figure drew closer, the sound of hooves carrying up through the still air. Whoever it was, they weren't coming by chance. The rider came on slow dust curling from the hooves of a bay mare. I recognized Sheriff Tom Keating before I could see his badge, his hat brim pulled low against the sinking sun. He swung down in front of the porch boots, settling in the dirt with a small puff. His face carried the miles he'd ridden that day. "Ewan," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His eyes shifted to Calla, and he gave her a short nod. "Evening, ma'am." I stepped down to meet him. "Tom, you're a long way from town this late." He glanced toward the ridge, then back to me. "Couldn't leave this for morning." "Thought you ought to hear it first, not from a talker at the store." Calla stayed by the porch rail, her hands resting on the top board. I could feel her listening without looking her way. Tom drew a folded sheet from his vest pocket, edges creased from the ride. "Came by telegraph to the office. Word out of Cedar Bluff." He held it for a moment, then handed it to me. The message was short, the letters punched hard into the paper. It named a man I didn't know, and it spoke of a claim, someone stepping forward saying he had rights to what Calla had left behind. When I looked up, Tom was watching close. He's got no ground to stand on, far as I can tell. But folks'll take sides fast if it's not handled right. Calla's voice was steady from the porch. "What does he want?" she asked. Tom shifted his weight. "From the sound of it, to take what he says is his, and to make you answer for things that aren't." The light was thinning, the shadows stretching long across the yard. I folded the paper and slid it into my shirt pocket. When I asked, "Soon. Could be a week, could be 2. I'll ride back to Cedar Bluff tomorrow, speak to the circuit judge. But you need to be ready." Calla stepped down, crossing the yard, until she stood beside me. "I've been ready longer than he's been looking," she said. Her eyes stayed on Tom, and he gave a slow nod. We saw him off as the first stars showed his mare's hoofbeats fading into the dark. Back inside, the lamp threw a small circle of light across the table. Calla set out 2 cups, the steam curling in the warm air. She didn't speak for a long while, just traced the rim of her cup with her thumb. When she finally looked up, her face was calm, her shoulders squared. "If he wants to bring it to a judge," she said, "then we'll bring the truth with us." I nodded. The garden rose waited under the moonlight outside, a sign of what we'd built here already. Whatever came over the next weeks, it would meet us standing. The morning of the hearing came, with a pale light, the kind that settles over the land before the sun climbs high. Calla and I rode into Cedar Bluff side by side, the dust rising in slow curls behind us. Folks turned to watch as we passed, their faces unreadable in the quiet. At the courthouse, Sheriff Tom Keating stood waiting on the steps, his hat low, a steady figure against the clapboard wall. He gave Calla a small nod and opened the door for us. Inside, the air was cooler, smelling faintly of oiled wood and paper. The circuit judge, a tall man named Henry Latham, sat behind the desk, his black coat buttoned to the throat. He listened as the man claiming Calla's property made his case, his voice sharp, his eyes avoiding hers. I kept my gaze on the judge, watching for any flicker of where his thoughts lay. When it was Calla's turn, she rose slowly, her skirt brushing the wooden floor. Her words were plain, without flourish, each one rooted in truth. She spoke of the work she'd done, the land she'd tended, the wrongs she'd endured without striking back. There was no tremor in her voice. Judge Latham asked his questions, and she answered them without shifting her eyes. The room was still when she finished, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm or a change in the wind. The judge leaned back, his hand resting on a stack of papers. "This court finds no merit in the claim," he said at last. "The property remains with Mrs. Calla McKenna, free and clear." The words seemed to lift something from the air. The man who had brought the claim muttered under his breath, but Sheriff Keating was already moving to see him out. Calla stood a moment longer, then turned to me, her shoulders easing for the first time in weeks. We left Cedar Bluff as the sun reached its height, the road stretching wide ahead. Back at the ranch, the wind carried the scent of sage, and the fields lay open under the bright sky. Calla walked the fence line that evening, her hand trailing over the weathered rails. I watched from the porch, knowing she was seeing the land as hers again, not just in law, but in peace. Life on the frontier doesn't often grant second chances, but when it does, they're worth holding. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet righting of a wrong, the simple act of being able to stay where you belong. If this story has found a place in you, take a moment to think on it, and if you'd like to hear more tales from these wide, dusty lands, you're welcome to stay with me a while.